Chapter 10. Electra returned to the station. Gary wasn't present. She did wonder for the first 10 minutes or so if he was in the toilet, ridding himself of his unchewed KFC. But when he didn't surface after that, she assumed he was off doing something else. She set off writing the reports, pulling the statements together with the notes made by the team. The software they used was little different to Microsoft Word, but allowed them to mark each section as a complete block. Then these blocks could be dragged into order once all the parts were present. Electra was impressed with the software. It was as though it was made just for her. Electra's brain stopped working when there was too much choice in front of her. Rather than try to organize, plot, and plan where to start, the software enabled her to just chip off parts of the whole and then order it after. Chapter 11. Augustine ran as fast as his legs could carry him. He was blessed with stamina, but not much in the way of speed. He could only recall a handful of times in his police career where he had needed to set off in chase of someone else. His lack of speed meant that the other person invariably created some gap in the first few minutes of the pursuit, but Augustine could just keep going at that speed for longer periods of time. All he needed to do was make sure that the target was still in sight. A long run wasn't going to put him off. Chasing someone he could see was easy. He had been taught in his early days as a police officer that shouting was a great tactic. If he was in a busy area, then shouting would draw the attention of others. It might result in someone sticking out a leg or trying to otherwise apprehend the fleeing criminal. But that was back in the days when knives and firearms weren't anywhere near as prevalent. Now, it was putting the public in immediate potential danger to ask them to help with the chasing down of a fleeing suspect. And let's not forget that this suspect was probably Ken Lazarus. All the time Augustine ran, he could hear the words from Lou in his ears. "I think he's doing a runner." Hardly concrete evidence that the guy was who they came for, or, indeed, that he was running away from the police. Maybe he owed money and wanted to get out of there before the heavies knocked on his door. Maybe he hung around with the wrong kind of people, the kind that you would run away from. Augustine kept moving. There was no other option. Past Thurloway's shop, presumably filled with kids on their way back from senior school. Along past the DACCS building, down towards John F. Kennedy School. That was where Lazarus would try to lose him, Augustine thought. There were too many different routes to disappear down once they got away from the busier roads and into an area that had alleyways, garages, and cut-throughs. Nevertheless, Augustine couldn't do much about it. He just wasn't built for speed. Chapter 12. As Lou walked up and down the path of the house, wondering what to do next, another movement caught his eye. The door of the adjacent property opened ajar. Then a pair of eyes peered through the gap, followed by the rest of a head and then a body. Lou thought about asking, "Can I help?" But the mouth of this body beat him to it.
"Can I help?" he asked. "I noticed that you knocked at the door. It's a door that gets a lot of knocks, I tell you, far more than mine at any rate."
As the man walked out onto the path so that him and Lou were separated only by a 3-foot-high hedge, he smiled. Lou reciprocated. The man was at least 70, with saggy skin across much of his face, like he had been given extra in case it was needed at a later date. It reminded Lou of his Uncle Frederick, a man whose head seemed to have shrunk all his life, but the skin didn't shrink back with it. The similarities between this man and his Uncle Frederick didn't stop there. He was wearing dungarees. Uncle Frederick always wore dungarees, saying that it served him well in his life as a painter and decorator, and he didn't see any reason to end the practice once he stopped working.
"Don't get many visitors?" Lou asked. "I get a few. My son visits me every Thursday on his way to badminton. He still plays now in his 50s. I suppose if you enjoy something, then there's no reason to ever stop." Oh, my name is Francis, by the way. Sorry, it's a bit rude that I didn't introduce myself straight away. And my name is Lou. How do you do, Francis? Lou replied, holding out his hand over the hedge to offer a handshake. Francis recoiled back, pulling his hands far up inside his sleeves. It's okay, Francis. I'm one of the good guys, Lou explained, as he pulled his ID from his trouser pocket. He was always told that he should have it on display somewhere on the top half of his body. That way, there was never any doubt that he was a detective. But whoever came up with this rule didn't account for the vagaries of northeast weather. It might be a beautiful sunny day in the morning, feeling like spring and promising warmth. But come lunchtime, it could be brewing up a storm, with the wind racing over Washington from the North Sea and giving everywhere a distinctly wintry feeling instead. Lou took off layers of clothing and put them back on again several times a day. It meant that he would be detaching and reattaching his ID every time he felt too hot or too cold, sensations that had become even more regular the older he got. Are you here for that man, or the people who came to visit him?
Chapter 13. Electra tried Gary's phone. It wasn't unusual for him to go missing, claiming that he had to follow up a lead or check the details at a crime scene. But that was when there was too little to do. When there was an investigation in mid-flow, Gary was the one that was all over it. As much as Electra detested the way he was around her at times, she secretly admired his work rate when there was the bit between his teeth. Gary was ruthlessly ambitious. Electra was the same, but without the ruthless part. 11 rings and then straight to voicemail. Nothing recorded by Gary, just the one set up by the phone company. Press 1 to record, star at the end if you wanted to hear it back, hashtag if you want to re-record. She left no message. The work was eating up enough time that she didn't think of any other way of locating him. She resolved to call Gary again half an hour later. In the meantime, there were plenty of reports to type up. Gary's typing wasn't up to scratch, so he couldn't have helped her much with that task at any rate. He typed like her father, looking across the keyboard for the required letter, as though they were relocated every time he looked away from the keyboard. She laughed to herself at the difference between the way the pair of them typed, and then got on with the task in hand. Electra plugged her headphones in and started typing, listening to Aphex Twin. She listened to the kind of music that nobody else did. Still stuck in the past, some of her exes told her. But she didn't care. Hearing noises, beeps, and bass got her working far better than listening to the same kind of boring love songs that the rest of the world plugged themselves into. Ballads were for old people, soppy people, everyone else. She needed a beat. The words flowed onto the page as though they were jumping from the handwritten form to the screen in front of her with no effort required. Electra was never trained in typing. It just came quite naturally to her. She didn't touch type or have much in the way of a smooth style, but her fingers jumped from key to key, schooled by years of typing, just knowing where the next place to put her finger. It was effective, if not pretty. This was the way of Electra's life. She didn't know much about how to draw, but was an absolute whiz at Pictionary. She just knew how to represent things, without the skill of being an artist. She didn't have any idea how to iron in the way she had been taught by her mother. She found a way that worked, as unconventional as anything, but her clothes came out looking like they had been freshly pressed by an expert. She looked out of the window and spied the first few drops of rain from a cloud overhead. The sky had darkened. Still no sign of Gary. Chapter 14. Augustine felt a splatter of rain hit his head. The slightest hint of a receding hairline that had accompanied his 40s made him feel like he was a better detector of rain than he ever had been in his life. Rain on the skin produced a very different feeling to rain on the hair, at least the first few drops at any rate. He opened up his stride, trying to maintain the speed that he had established. It felt like his target was slowing, getting closer stride by stride, even if it was only an inch at a time. He wanted this over before he was drenched. The sky looked as though it should provide something in the way of shelter. The darkness always caught Augustine out. He felt that when the sky blackened, it should provide an umbrella against the rain. The clouds that everyone else saw for what they were, he imagined were opening to stop the rain falling through the earth. It took a splat of rain to awaken him from this delusion. Then he fell for it again, the next time it rained. He looked around and was astonished at the scant number of people out and about. For a town of this size, he expected to see new faces around every corner. But as he looked with anticipation, every corner brought more of the same emptiness he was leaving behind. The character running away from him knew where he could get away without being spotted, that was for sure. If he did make it out of the clutches of Augustine Boyle, then he would have very little in the way of witnesses to attach him to that escape. Augustine could see the man struggling with the pace of the chase. The man was breathing heavily, shoulders moving up and down in a regular beat, grasping for the air that would keep the body moving forward. Augustine was now within 50 yards and ready to gather in his prey. He felt like he was only a minute or so from catching up with him. Chapter 15. Lou sat in the front room of Francis, the neighbour of the house where they had hoped to find Ken Lazarus. Francis was still tentative, looking at Lou like he was an intruder rather than someone who just wanted to talk. But talk they would. Lou wasn't going to let things happen any other way.
You said that he gets a lot of visitors.
Lou started with a cup of tea in one hand and a saucer of biscuits in the other. Francis explained that he had just put the kettle on and insisted that he make any guest a cuppa. It just wasn't right any other way. Lou looked around, trying to find somewhere safe to put the saucer of biscuits. There was nowhere evident, and the sofa arm right next to him looked like it had been taken care of to the nth degree.
He has people there dropping by at all times of the day and night. Some come and go, probably thinking they haven't been spotted. But I know everything that goes on. The walls are far too thin to keep any secrets from a neighbour here.
And are there secrets that he wouldn't want you to know?
Oh, yes, there are plenty of those. He thinks he's being clever, but we all do when we're not being caught, don't we, Detective?
I suppose. I don't really do anything that I need to keep a secret from the rest of the world. It's kind of par for the course in my job.
Are you telling me that everyone who works for the police is squeaky clean? 'Cause I don't believe that for 1 second.
Oh, good point. Well made, Francis. I know just what you mean. It's like the gambler who feels invincible after a few wins. He doesn't accept that he will lose eventually, and in the end, we're all caught out.
So, the same goes with me neighbour, Mr. Lazarus. His post sometimes ends up through me door. That's the only way I know his name. Aside from that, he tries to keep himself to himself, as far as this neighbourhood goes. But we're all aware of what he is. People arriving in a car out the front, only for him to go out and speak through the passenger window. It all looks pretty innocuous, doesn't it? But I wasn't born yesterday. Even with these eyes that have been through 3 operations for cataracts and a detached retina, I can see him pick up something from the armrest and throw something into the car. Not as clever as he thinks. These visitors come regularly, so I guess he makes good money from it. I don't like it, but I can't put myself in danger. My grandkids visit me twice a week on their way back from school. I can't put them in a position where they get caught up in this business. As long as those visitors come and go quickly, I suppose that's as much as I can ask for. Francis spoke with clarity. Lou loved the way the older generation spoke. They had been schooled, brutally at times, to ensure that they spoke and wrote in what was referred to as the King's English at the time. It still had that unmistakable Washington twang, but was as clear as day. "And has he had any visitors today?" Lou asked. "There's only been one. It was about an hour before you two arrived at the door. The man stayed for around 10 minutes. There were heated voices. I suspect that he owes the guy something. It was that kind of conversation." Are there many of those conversations? Lou prompted Francis to continue. Quite a few, but not usually with this man. He rarely pops by, and then only for a minute at a time, not even entering the property. This is the first time he has walked through the front door for quite a while, and definitely the longest he has ever stayed. Drives a flash car, too.
Francis tried to remember all the information he had. It seemed from the manner of the detective that this visit was important. Lou munched a bourbon biscuit, savouring the taste. It wasn't quite his favourite, especially when he had to eat it properly, but was high on his top 10. Bourbons and custard creams were best eaten alone as far as Lou was concerned. He could bite the biscuit off the top, nibble his way around the edge, leaving only the cream filling and a piece of biscuit the size of the cream filling. Then he would happily eat the remaining biscuit, engrossing himself in every mouthful. It wasn't quite a chocolate hobnob, his favourite, but wasn't that far behind. Lou took the opportunity to take his time over the next sentence. Mouthful after mouthful of biscuit gave him the chance to watch the expression on the face of Francis. It was as though he was searching for a final piece of information, one that was useful but was evading all attempts to be brought back to the fore of his mind. Lou looked intently, hoping as much as Francis that the detail would reappear.
It's French, Francis offered. What, the car? Lou inquired. No, they don't make flash cars, do they? Not the car. There is something French to do with this visitor. The clothes look distinctly British, the car German, but there is a link to something about France. Can't quite bring it to mind.
Both men paused for a few seconds. Lou was never any good at games like this. Charades passed him by. The thoughts that were obviously clear in the mind of the person acting out the charade made no sense at all to him. They would plead with him to say what they were thinking and performing. He had no idea whatsoever what they were telling him. Not the wrong idea. No idea came to his mind at all. Blank looks all round. He would wait as long as it took.
The name, Lazarus kept calling the guy by a French name.
A French name? Lou asked, still perplexed. He was much better with words than he was reading expressions.
Yes, that's it, Francis exclaimed. Now I just have to remember what that name was. Is it important?
Is it Pierre? Lou responded. A question with a question. It wasn't what he had been trained to do, but it felt too much of a coincidence that he had heard a French name earlier and now someone was trying to recall another right in front of him at that moment.
Yes, Pierre, Francis responded.
As Lou left Francis's house, he spotted a part of the bush between the neighbours that had been pushed in. Lou reached his hand inside and saw a wrap toolkit, the kind his uncle used when Lou was young. He unrolled the toolkit and looked at the contents, all screwdrivers. There were 6 spaces in total, but only 5 screwdrivers present. Chapter 16. Electra was more than satisfied with her progress typing up the reports and gathering all the information that compiled a full report. Maybe someone else working with her was just a distraction. She had always told herself that she needed someone else to work with, bounce ideas off. On the few occasions she just got down to working on her own, she was more than capable of completing all her tasks. Maybe the other person was just a distraction, someone she could blame on stalling. If there were 2 of them to share the blame, then it wasn't quite as painful as shouldering all of that herself. She finished the last words on the last report. The next step would be to put all of these in order, add a summary, and then have it ready for the rest of the team and Marie. As she looked around the room, wondering when the next soul would join her, one did. Ash walked through the door, with a puzzled look and a stack of papers that weighed heavily in his hands. "What's up, Ash?" Electra asked. "Nothing," he replied. "Can't be nothing. You're pulling a face that looks like you've been chewed up and spat out by someone. What's up, Ash?" she repeated, hoping for a different answer. just as she thought to a phrase a friend had put on Facebook that day. A definition of insanity was doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Ash answered in a different way. That's the problem. Nothing. I've got the records here of 26 people. Aside from Ken Lazarus, who we're already speaking to, there is nothing to go on. Not a single one of them has ever passed through the police system, not even for a speeding fine. Doesn't that sound a little weird? We're used to dealing with people who break the law. It can be easy to forget that this is only a small proportion of the population. Most people keep their noses clean. I suppose. But that means we need to concentrate all of our attention on Lazarus at the moment and hope it's him. Otherwise, we're staring at a blank slate. I never like looking at a blank slate. It means we're waiting for the criminal to make the next move. If they never make another move, then we never make an arrest. Game over. Where's Gary? No idea. Tried his phone a while ago. Mind calling him? He might be ignoring me. You know what he's like. Electra asked with the biggest smile in her armoury. She saved it for when she wanted someone to do something she didn't want to do. Ash was already dialing, knowing he didn't stand a chance when Electra was in a mood like this. Gary, we need you back at the station, mate. Things are moving at a decent pace. Sorry, gotta go. I've got a call on the other line. Ash moved the phone away from the side of his face so he could see who was calling. It's Lou, he said to Electra as he pushed the green button on his phone and answered the call. Chapter 17. Augustine was striding forward at quite a pace now. He looked left and right across the road, searching for a good place to make his play and bring the suspect to heel. The last things he wanted were an audience or a place where the man could escape again once he caught him up. Stride for stride, Augustine was now burning into the lead of the man he believed was Ken Lazarus. As he caught the man up, the odd glance over the shoulder from the pursued told Augustine all he needed to know about the identity of the suspect. It was definitely Ken Lazarus, no mistake. He wore a massive beard that must have taken hours of attention every week to ensure it looked that way. Augustine was personally impressed with the current trend for the beard, but didn't have the time nor the patience to maintain one. So he shaved every few days instead, telling himself that it took up far less time than a proper beard. In reality, he had no idea how long it might take, plus he liked the feel of the stubble on his face. Lazarus had the deepest brown eyes, almost the same shade as his beard. It made his face look like it had been coloured in by a child with a limited number of crayons, but somehow it all worked together. Deep brown hair, deep brown eyes, deep brown beard. It was only the flashes of pale skin in between the darkness that gave Wind there was a face in there. No wonder the skin was so white. There was precious little light allowed through to darken the skin in any way. Lazarus was in his 40s, but dressed like a teenager. Not the teenager he was when he was younger, but the current teens. His penchant for designer clothes brands was paid for by his criminal activities. Gucci D2 and Moose Knuckles clothing were some of those he sported on a regular basis, but his favourite brand of all was Stone Island. The designer clothing shops in the Metro Centre and Newcastle City Centre both loved and loathed Ken Lazarus in equal measure. He spent big when he went there, but his obnoxious attitude made the transaction painful. They had little choice to put up with it. That was the kind of fear he instilled in his fellow man. Lazarus looked like he was ready to explode at any given moment. That earned him something short of respect, more like a wariness from everyone who encountered him. Even the 7-foot-tall bouncer at Flannels in the Metro Centre was wary of Ken Lazarus. He never turned his back on the man, that was for sure. Augustine made the interception opposite the best one-shop in Columbia. There was a row of houses before Lazarus could duck behind and have several options to escape. Augustine knew that his best bet was to make the capture there. The houses had a row of allotments behind, then a school field, and then alleyways over, under, and beside roads. Each house was well presented, except for one, which looked like it had been a dumping ground at some stage in the recent past. The same with the allotments. The rain was in fat drops now. Augustine was ready to find shelter somewhere. He caught Lazarus by the wrist and barged him into the wall outside the end house on the terrace, strong enough to bring him to heel, careful enough not to knock him off his feet. Accusations of brutality would hinder the investigation. Augustine wanted a clean job on this one.
Ken Lazarus, I'm here to ask you a few questions. Do you mind accompanying me back to where we started? I have a car there where we can make our way to the station.
Whatever, pig. Chapter 18.
Ash, what was the name of that French guy again? You know, the one that you spoke to at the Campanile head office.
Pierre White.
Thought so. Just double-checking. Would you be surprised to hear that White was seen visiting Ken Lazarus today?
Well, the fact that White was caught up in something wouldn't surprise me at all. The fact that he was caught up in something with Ken Lazarus would be a big surprise. Didn't think he would be linked to a lowlife like that.
Well, it seems like he is, or he has been at least. We're here at the last known address for Lazarus. As we knocked on the door, Augustine gave chase. I stayed here, and a kind neighbour has filled me in on some of Lazarus's recent activity, including a flash car rolling up outside the front and a man with a French name visiting a few times over the last few months, including earlier today. Sounds like too much of a coincidence, doesn't it?
I'm on my way back to Gateshead. Sod the traffic, Ash replied. Where is Augustine?
I've not heard from him since. Only just got this piece of information, so I thought I'd better check in with you. Wait, I've got another call. How do you use this damn phone? Ah, right, that's it. Augustine is on the phone right now. Speak later.
Lou hung up. His voice had got quieter and quieter as he spoke, moving the phone away from the side of his face so he could see the display.
Augustine, we have a development.
So do I. Can you come round and pick me up? I'm close to John F. Kennedy School. I'd like to get this guy back to the station. He's filling my ears with abuse. All I want is to get him in for questioning.
I'm on the way, Augustine.
Lou thanked Francis for his tea, biscuits, and help. He looked down and realised he'd demolished the whole saucer of biscuits. A smile would be payment enough, he assured himself, before grinning inanely at Francis and making his way to the car. Left, right, and right again would reunite him with Augustine, and presumably Ken Lazarus. As he turned the last corner, Lou looked up and saw Augustine looking triumphant, with Lazarus much quieter than he might have expected. He pulled up and opened the back door to the car.
Okay, Augustine?
Yes, Lou. I just needed some respite from this guy. He's a lot quieter now.
So I see. How did you manage that?
I told him his usual solicitor was on holiday, so he'd have to put up with one appointed by us. He didn't seem to like that piece of information. I know Cal Green well enough from our past encounters to know that he likes a couple of weeks in the Canaries at this time of year. The three of them travelled in silence to the station. It was the kind of noise that Augustine was prepared for. Too much noise was just that, too much. Silence in certain parts of the day kept Augustine sane, or as close to sane as he could. They stepped out of the car, booked Lazarus in at the desk, and found him a cell until the solicitor arrived. Augustine guessed this would be anything up to an hour, so he got some rest. Electra was busy typing away at the reports. Ash was going to see Pierre White, and Lou was tracking down Gary. There was little else he could do except refresh, ready to speak to their prime suspect. Chapter 19. Augustine never grew bored of the job itself, but there were times during the day that he wished he was somewhere else. He was finding some of the murders in the city quite a draw on his personal resources. It was feast or famine in the murder game. The summer months were the ones where more murders were carried out. He concluded that murder was a fair-weather sport, just like cricket. In the winter, he needed to fill in the time in places. There were only so many training courses he could attend. He had that thing called imagination to rely on. It was something he'd seen younger generations lose their connection to over time. As a kid, Augustine could walk out of the house, come back 10 hours later, and never see a moment of boredom. He would see a line of ants marching from a source of food to somewhere off in the distance. An hour at least would pass as he followed the trail, picking on a single ant to watch as it marched slowly but surely from where he first encountered it to their home. Augustine took his time with all of these things, carefully seeing what would happen if he put an obstacle in the way. They just worked their way around it, a skill that we humans could do with more of, a skill that we clearly didn't have, not anywhere as much as the ants. Then he would find a playground, the kind that we all enjoyed in our youth, one filled with the basics and nothing but the basics. 3 swings, 1 roundabout, a slide and a seesaw. Perfect. This would while away several hours all on its own. The roundabout was a particular favourite. Augustine would find someone to play with, take it in turns to leave a twig or a lolly stick on the ground and challenge the other to collect it. Putting the lolly stick farther out, away from the roundabout, or closer in, nearing the spinning piece of wood and metal would deliver more of a challenge. And the swings were just as much fun. After the sheer joy of just swinging backwards and forwards, powering yourself into motion from a standing start had stopped, a more competitive element made its way into his world. It didn't necessarily have to be against someone else. Just getting higher and higher was the challenge. He'd look to see where his eyes reached in the horizon as he swung backwards and forwards. Or Augustine would try to work out from his moment how close he was to the horizontal. Looking to get above that level was the first step. Soon after that, he would think he was getting close to going over the top, although he didn't think it was a physical possibility. It just felt like it was going to happen one day. It felt like the planet was set up in that way. From the playground, Augustine would walk among trees, picking off leaves and seeing what they were made of. Some pulled veins out as he started at the stalk. This made a satisfying pattern on the leaf. Trying 10 of these, he soon realized that they were like snowflakes in the way that no 2 leaves were the same. That was a challenge in itself. So, Augustine started pulling scores of leaves to see if he could find a match for one that had already gone. He looked up precariously, thinking that he'd find a tree completely bald of leaves, but the trees Augustine was working with must have had tens of thousands of leaves, because even in the small section he was working with, the leaves looked as jam-packed and full of life as ever. As a kid, he felt that trees were made for climbing. Childhood living next to a wood was behind that view of the world. Augustine decided quite early on in life that every tree in the world could be climbed. You just had to find a way of making it happen. He thought he could distribute his weight differently and make himself as light as a feather if the branches of a tree were slight and looked instantly breakable. If the tree was filled with spikes, then he would tell himself that the barbs in his hand, arms and legs were temporary and wouldn't cause him any long-term harm. He was perfectly right, but they stung like mad at the time. If the tree had no branches until around 10 feet from the ground, Augustine would look for a nearby tree that would give him access to those first branches. Augustine saw himself as a tree version of Sir Edmund Hillary. His brother was Sherpa Tenzing. Together, they would conquer every tree on the planet. The tallest tree out there was their target. Inevitably, a day away from home would end with the pangs of hunger. Augustine would look at his Seiko watch, the ones with calculator inserted, like he would need access to complex mathematical answers at the drop of a hat, and know that it was closing in on tea time. No mobile phones for his mum to call and remind him that dinner would be ready in half an hour. Just a hunger and a sense of time that drew him and his brother closer to home and sustenance at the right time. The consequences of missing a curfew one day might be staying in the next, and he really didn't want that. There was too much world out there to explore. His brother was now gone. He could remember the car journeys as a child, sat in the back of his parents' car, eating up the motorway miles across the country as they visited relatives, attractions, and sought something they couldn't get at home. He closed his eyes and pictured what it used to feel like. It had been so many years, but the warmth of the sun through the window of his office was close enough to the warmth of the car window from all those years before that he could quickly transport himself back to the back of a Renault Megane in only a few seconds. And then everything else came with it. The slight feeling of sickness as the road undulated and his stomach didn't follow the dip with the car and the rest of his body. Looking at the back of two headrests, the back of two parents' heads, and the back of the cars in front. At first, he thought the names of the cars were something to behold. Toyota Camry, Range Rover Evoque, and the odd Ford Transit were names that filled his head with visions of craftsmen putting together these specimens with care and attention. Transit, made specifically for getting things from A to B, was the epitome of the way words explained products and concepts in a single swoop. He pictured men, all men, only men, in boiler suits of greys and blues that walked up and down inspecting the vehicles in case they needed a little more of that all-important care and attention before being released to the public. Maybe a small polish above the front passenger side wheel arch to ensure it looked its best. Sometimes a tweak with some pliers where one side looked ever so slightly out of alignment with the other. Not noticeable to the naked eye. Well, the naked eye of the layman, at any rate. The specialist car maker, in the eyes of the younger Augustine, could spot these things without even looking. And it was the name of the car that gave him all of this data. Just seeing that they had given the badge Camry or Evoque was enough for him to know that they have paid all the due care and attention that would ever be needed. They felt like names that conjured up images of power and glory. It wasn't until he got a little older and saw the names of American cars that were filled with testosterone that he ever thought twice about his theory of the way cars went from the imagination of the designer to the road in front of the head of one of his parents, itself in front of the headrest in front of him. His trip down memory lane was disturbed by a knock at his door.
"The solicitor is here. I've shown him in with Lazarus. They'll be ready in 5 minutes."
Chapter 20. Ash had the same issue with the barrier in the car park at the Campanile head office, but this time he wasn't about to park a distance away. It felt like there was an urgency. He slapped on the hazard lights, pulled as far to the left as he possibly could, and jumped out. The same secretary was having what could easily have been the same conversation. He bypassed her and pressed the button to call the lift. There was little point in trying to get an appointment or waiting for her to call up. If White was involved in something, then the element of surprise would help him nip that in the bud. Pierre White might have felt he had the upper hand the last time they spoke. That wouldn't be the case this time. Ash was ready. The lift doors lurched open. They didn't feel as slick as they did earlier that day. He looked over his shoulder. The receptionist hadn't skipped a beat in her conversation. His car indicators were still flashing away intermittently. The sky was turning a mid-late afternoon shade of deep blue, preparing for the evening sunset and darkness. The spots of rain that had accompanied his drive over from Washington to Gateshead had dissipated. The wind blew the trees over the road, almost doubling them over. But that was the way of the northeast, Ash told himself. The place he called home was always a few moments away from cold. The proximity to the North Sea made sure of that. He noticed the lift doors lurching back to closed, so put his hand and foot in the door to stop it. For a moment, Ash felt like it wasn't going to stop, but half a second later, the doors jarred to a halt, and then reversed their direction. He stepped inside. As he pressed the button for the floor where he had met Pierre White earlier, Ash felt a stickiness on his finger. It was the kind of texture you might expect getting in a lift in a busy shopping centre in the school holidays. Ash drew his finger back towards his face to get a good look. Blood. He felt down by his side, wiping the blood away on his trousers. He was so transfixed by the sight of blood that he almost missed the lift door's opening on the floor he had selected. Drawn by a distant light in the corner of the floor, Ash walked slowly over. Step by step, he strode, quietly, hoping not to disturb whoever was at that light. Most of the floor was open plan, but this corner must have been somewhere that needed privacy. Even though it was mainly open plan, as in it wasn't a separate office space, there were screens set up. 2 screens, one parallel to the outside wall of the building and one at right angles to the first. He had to walk around the right of the makeshift room to see what was behind the screens. They sat from floor to ceiling, affixed by metal feet at the bottom, and some kind of improvised fabric connection at the top. Ash stepped around the corner, small strides. His first stride into the enclosed area was joined by pushing heavily into something around ankle level. Ash hit the deck and banged his head. He looked up groggily from his position on the floor. "Fuck," he murmured. Chapter 21.
Now, I'm not sure why you have my client in here.
It was the same old routine, no matter which solicitor sat in the chair. He was pleased that it wasn't Cal Green. His assertion that Green was sunning himself in the Canaries was correct, but it was as though every defense solicitor had been schooled in exactly the same way. They faked incredulity that the client they were representing could even be considered for questioning, no matter what the situation. "Well, we do," Augustine replied. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. Lazarus was there, was suspected, had been seen with Pierre White, had an access key to the hotel, and ran away when they knocked at the front door. Enough to at least have a chat, Augustine mused. "Ken Lazarus, where were you early this morning? Specifically, from around 1 o'clock this morning until around 1:30, Augustine asked, straight to the point. Get the details. "I was doing the same thing as most people in Washington. I was in my bed, asleep." "Why? What were you doing?" Lazarus spat back. His solicitor grasped Lazarus's wrists in an attempt to get him to calm down. He knew that a calm suspect was far more likely to hold their tongue. Lazarus pushed the solicitor away, almost knocking him off his chair. The solicitor gathered himself, edged his chair around a foot further away from Lazarus, and then looked at Augustine to continue. "And do you have anyone who can confirm this?" "No, I sleep alone, kind of like Christian Grey." Augustine recognized the name, but didn't know who this Christian Grey character was. Maybe another criminal that both he and Lazarus were aware of. No, that didn't sound right. It was something from literature. He resolved to ask a lecturer when he had finished with Lazarus. She read loads, and she would know immediately. "Shame. Are you sure nobody saw you late yesterday? What did you do before you went to bed? What time did you get into bed? Go to sleep?" Augustine fired the questions at Lazarus. "No. Ate a burger and watched the telly. 11, just after." Lazarus fired the answers right back. Augustine would have to find another tactic. That wasn't going to work. "What burger did you have?" "Huh? What burger? Homemade? McDonald's? Microwave?" "Whopper. Can't beat a Whopper," Lazarus replied. Augustine wondered how many Whoppers he was being told. At least the solicitor had piped down. "I'm a bacon double cheese man myself, but I can see the attraction in a Whopper. Just the burger, or anything else to go with it? Fries, Coke, the classic way to eat a Whopper. Can you think of any other way to do it?" "No, not really. You like the modern classics, then?" "Yes. The stuff from years ago doesn't quite cut it as far as I'm concerned. If a movie is in black and white, then it's automatically crap, if you ask me.
Same with any TV made before the turn of the millennium. Modern classics are the future. Anyway, what's this got to do with me being in here?
Nothing, Ken. Just wanted to chew the fat a little. So, what's a guy like you watching TV last night?
That one with Keith Lemon in, I think. Most television looks pretty much the same nowadays, doesn't it?
Not if it was made this millennium, no. What channel?
Pardon me?
What channel did you watch it on? I noticed that your satellite dish was hanging off the roof with the wires cut, so you had to watch it on terrestrial TV. What channel was it on? Augustine pressed. It wasn't going to send the man to prison, but he felt it was starting to unravel some of the lies he was being told. It's a Channel 4 thing, isn't it? Not sure. Who were the guests? I'm rubbish at this kind of thing. I only ever watched the first episode of I'm a Celebrity because I've never heard of any of them. There are as many celebrities in Washington as on that programme, as far as I can tell. More people here than I know, at any rate. I think it was that Paddy guy who's on everything. Aside from that, there was a couple of women that Keith perved over. The rest mean nothing to me, Ken Lazarus explained, as best as he could. The solicitor had his head in his hands. He knew that the best alibis were vague, especially if they were spurious. His client was digging himself into a hole that he couldn't dig him out of. Augustine looked down, and he had made one note during the interview. Electra, who the hell is Christian Grey? Chapter 22. Ash scrambled for his phone. It was deep inside a pocket on the front of his cargo pant trousers. He liked to wear something that gave him freedom to move and had plenty of pocket space. In his youth, Ash carried a baseball cap with all of his items in, sat on the passenger seat of his car. When he got out, he struggled to find spaces for all his items: wallet, car keys, house keys, etc. So when he first laid eyes on a pair of cargo pants in Gap, he fell in love. They weren't as smart as he wanted to be when working, but the practicality was all he had ever wished for. The phone wasn't easy to reach. Ash thought he had taken the blow from landing on the floor with his head, but the screaming pain from his shoulder was first evident when he reached low. He rolled over onto his other side and tried to reach across his body with his right hand into his left pocket. It was difficult, but still far easier than using the arm below his damaged shoulder. He lifted his leg, and the phone wriggled its way towards his midriff. His right hand grabbed it, and he pushed it against the forefinger of his right hand to unlock. He had stopped a while ago with iPhones, not wanting to become someone who bought a new version every year and followed the crowd. If it wasn't for the functionality of the phone, such as being able to FaceTime friends, he would have jumped ship and gone for another brand with another operating system. But he had stayed. His whole life was on his phone. The phone flashed into life, and he looked for someone else on the team. He decided that authority was the order of the day, so called Augustine. All the time he kept his eyes forward as much as he could. No answer. It rang 11 times before kicking into his answer phone. Pointless leaving a message there. He then tried Gary and got exactly the same response. Didn't know why he called Gary second, just felt right. Obviously, it wasn't. Electra was third on the list, not because she was the third most important member of the team, but just because she came to mind next. An answer. Electra, I think Pierre White is dead. He's been injured outside of here, made his way into his office, and he's on the floor here. In fact, I've just tripped up over his body 60 seconds ago. Fucking hell, Ash! No breathing. Hang on a second. No pulse as far as I can tell. Yes, you know what? I'll call an ambulance just to be on the safe side. But the cut is deep, and the blood is everywhere now, Ash replied, as he checked the pulse of the man and then looked down at the pool of blood he was now occupying. He didn't want to sit there, but didn't feel like he was capable of moving very far. I'll make that 2 ambulances, actually. I'm not feeling too good. Silence. Chapter 23. Ash! Ash! Can you hear me? Electra repeated. She must have said these same words over and over as many as 15 times. All she got from the other end of the phone was a muffled breathing noise, like the snoring of one of her first partners. It sent shivers through her spine to think back to the kind of man she settled for when she was young. She put the phone down and sprang into action. Ambulance to the Campanile headquarters. Gateshead, please. My colleague called to say he found someone in a really bad state, and it seems that he has passed out too. Can you get someone there straight away, please? 10 minutes maximum. I'll settle for that. Electra spoke as she walked along the corridor to the interview room, where Augustine was talking to Ken Lazarus. Brown floor tiles sat uncomfortably with yellow painted walls. Not her favourite colours, and even less appealing in unison. She knocked on the door, entering a second later. It was a knock that announced her arrival in the room, not one that asked for permission to enter. Augustine, we're taking a break for a few minutes. Again, not asking for permission. Taking control of the situation. What? Augustine mouthed in her direction. He needn't have bothered. She had spun on her heels and back out of the room. Augustine put down his pen and stated that the interview was paused. He invited Ken Lazarus and the solicitor to leave the room before him. Both declined. Lazarus couldn't be bothered, as much as the solicitor didn't want to be left alone with the guy who had already manhandled him. It felt like a good time to be alone with him and try to steer Lazarus towards a better way of responding, not that he held out much hope of success. Chapter 24. Electra, what the hell? Augustine snapped. He felt he was in a good place with the interview, getting Lazarus to dig himself a hole. Pierre White might be dead, and Ash might not be in a good way either. We've got a couple of ambulances on the way to Campanile HQ. Do you want me to go there too? Yes. Take Gary with you. No sign of him. Just wait until I see him. What the hell is he playing at? As if by magic, Gary walked through the door, just as they were talking. He had a smile on his face as wide as the Tyne Bridge, looking to all intents and purposes as if he had just won the lottery, and he turned up solely to hand in his notice. Boss? Gary nodded, as though it was perfectly normal to disappear in the middle of a highly charged and time-sensitive investigation. Gary, where have you been? Gathering evidence. Where else would I be? He responded, with an innocence that belied his usual manner. I'll deal with you later, Augustine fired, as he walked off in the direction of the interview room, nodding at Electra to confirm that she knew what was expected of her. A nod back gave him all the confirmation he needed. Electra, do I need to do anything with the notes? Gary asked. No, all typed up. I could have done with the help, but in the end found that I didn't need you, she replied with some barb. She didn't like the way Gary waltzed in and out of the team as he saw fit. Good. Where are they? I've got some stuff to add. Check the system, Gary. Chapter 25. Where were we? Augustine spoke as he walked back into the room, wanting to pick up exactly where he left off. He felt that he was reaching a critical part of the discussion and was aggrieved to be interrupted, but he understood completely that Electra had to speak to him. I don't really have anything to add, Lazarus said, making eye contact and smiling at his appointed solicitor. I've already told the other detective all I know. Augustine choked on Ken's words. Chapter 26. Electra headed off to Gateshead on her own. Gary had some writing up to do, and she couldn't wait. The traffic was same old, nothing particularly busy, but not light enough to fly through. The Felling bypass was the main culprit in the slight delay she experienced, even with a flashing light and siren on her car. It was heavy at the junctions. Heworth metro station seemed to attract traffic all the time. She wondered if the traffic light system needed an overhaul. Electra recalled reading an article sent to her by Augustine about traffic lights. One major European city, her vague memory told her it was Budapest, trialled over a few weeks, turning off all the traffic lights and reverting each intersection to just a junction. It improved traffic flow by 30%. Accidents almost completely disappeared, and people were much happier. Their response was to turn the traffic lights back on, quoting some obscure research that stated traffic lights controlled the flow of traffic, which reduced air pollution. It didn't seem to add up as far as Electra was concerned, but it was way out of her jurisdiction. Budapest would have to sort their own problems out. She was outside the headquarters of the Campanile Hotel organization in around 9 minutes, which was far too long for Electra, as she was in a heightened state of worry about Ash. She burst through the doors to be confronted by a receptionist stood between her and the lifts. There was nothing else on the ground floor. "Can I get through?" Electra asked as she flashed her badge. The receptionist didn't budge, didn't say a word, as though she had been turned to stone by Electra's stare. "Can I get to the lift?" she asked again. The receptionist stepped aside, still not finding any words by way of response. Electra tapped the button for the lift, as though some kind of rhythm would speed it up to her liking. She used to think that there was a similar pattern with the buttons on pedestrian crossings when she was a child. Her first thought was that by tapping 3 times in 3 seconds in a regular pattern would turn the lights facing the traffic red, and the lights facing her would display a green man, allowing her to cross. She tried to reconcile this with the experience of Budapest, or whatever European city it was. Maybe they needed bridges and underpasses for every crossing. Maybe this was the reason they didn't continue with the trial. The lift got there in its own sweet time. She jumped in, trying not to step on the gaps, another childhood thing brought into adulthood, and waited for the doors to close. Electra counted the seconds until the lift arrived on the floor marked as the Campanile head office. It took 18 of her counted seconds. She had no idea how accurate her count was. The heart in her chest was shaking to the point where she could see her clothes move up and down to the swifter beat it was drumming out. She looked across the floor of the office to see a pair of legs protruding into the corridor. "Who is it?" A groan by way of response. "Ash?" Another groan. Electra was on her own, worrying that Ash had been hurt. The determination to get to his aid had stopped her rational thought. She stepped towards the legs and the groan, hoping that it was friendly. Chapter 27. "Why the fuck did you talk to Lazarus?" Augustine ranted at Gary. "Not sure why that's a problem, Boyle. You wanted to speak to him. Are you just pissed off that I got there first?" "We agreed before lunch. You knew the role I had in mind for you." Augustine calmed his voice a little, but not to the point where he felt calm within himself. "And I don't agree anymore. I wanted to speak to the guy. I knew where he was going to be. Time was of the essence. I pulled out of the car park opposite KFC and could see you lot still stuffing your faces. I ate quickly, the early bird and all that. And you didn't think to let me know. You'd have just told me to back down. I know I can get results, but you don't give me the chance. I took matters into my own hands. Isn't that what all the training is about at the moment? Aren't you supposed to be empowering me to be the best detective I can be?" Gary spat back at Augustine, backing him into a corner. Augustine was frustrated with Gary's actions, but couldn't find the words to counter his argument. He knew that at 3 o'clock the next morning he would come up with the perfect response, but it wouldn't come to his head or mouth when he needed it most. "Did you make notes?" Augustine asked, to try to divert the conversation away from where Gary was headed. "Notes, yeah." "But you knew we were going to arrest him. Talking and letting him walk away was always going to cause a problem, and it would have saved me a run of about a mile or 2. Is that what the problem is, Boyle? You've had to do something that's outside of your comfort zone? We're all encouraged to get out of our comfort zone every now and again," replied Gary, quoting the recent training session again. The police had focused heavily on the way people were managed and motivated. Augustine had been given the training separately with his boss Marie and the rest of the senior management team, as they had become known. All of the senior detectives, the team leads, were classified as middle management, but were included with the seniors for training. It was then their job to pass this information down to the rest of the team. Augustine and Marie carried out a training session for his team and the teams of all the other lead detectives. They were happy to pass this task on to Augustine. They felt too busy or too important to be doing it themselves. "Let's take a look at the notes," Augustine replied. He knew he had to close the conversation down. It was no use pressurizing Gary when he was in this mood. He would just resist until one or both of them blew up. The two of them pored over the notes. Augustine felt his ears prick up like a cat as he detected gaps in the story that he had been subjected to. No mention of Burger King. No mention of Keith Lemon. Vagaries of eating and watching television were there. No detail was present. It was as though the solicitor had been present when Gary had interviewed Lazarus, and then disappeared when he was under formal investigation. The stories were the wrong way round. "Let's go back in there together," Augustine suggested. Gary nodded approval. Chapter 28. Electra breathed as deeply as she could remember. She stepped forward one slow pace at a time, hoping to find something more appealing than the sight she approached was suggesting. She looked at the legs she could see, wondering if they belonged to Ash. She was usually pretty good at these things, but Ash was an average man in terms of build, and wore the kind of clothes that didn't distinguish him from the other people in the area. Blue trousers, white trainers, and a dark hoodie were his usual attire, which matched him with about half of the male suspects they were sent after. She walked forward and reached the junction between the desks where she could see the office open out. This was where she was at a point that revealed what was going on, but also where she would be at her most vulnerable. As she turned the corner, she saw a pool of blood and Ash laid face down. Chapter 29. "What time did you go to bed again?" Augustine asked Ken Lazarus. He had Gary's notes out in front of him. He was cross-referencing these with the answers Ken had given earlier. Then, these were cross-referenced further with the responses Ken Lazarus was giving to the two of them at that very point. The gap between Lazarus and his appointed solicitor had opened up again. "It was late, I know that. I told you. I had a burger and then watched some trashy TV. There's no crime in that, is there?" Augustine wondered if they were asking the right questions. His pause in firing questions allowed Gary to jump in. "What kind of burger did you eat? What TV did you watch? Some of that stuff is criminal, but we can't arrest for it," Gary asked, trying to inject some humour in a point where it was neither needed nor welcome. "Burger King. I had a Whopper," Lazarus responded. "I think we're being fed a Whopper," Gary replied, voicing what the rest of the room were thinking. Gary always put voice to those thoughts that washed around the head of other people but didn't make it as far as their lips. "I can tell you what happened if you want," Ken offered. "Where did you get a Burger King from?" "The nearest one, in my reckoning, is at Whitemare Pool. From our checks, you don't have a driving licence at the moment. A few too many beers and a drive home put paid to that one," Augustine interjected, trying to keep Gary calm and the interview strictly on a factual basis. "Then nick me for driving without a licence. You've got me banged to rights. You're good, you two. I think only Washington's finest could have solved the case of Ken Lazarus driving without a licence. You should be very proud. How much money are you on a year, the pair of you? And my taxes contribute to those astronomical wages. Don't you have real criminals to catch?" Lazarus shot across the room. Gary looked perturbed, but Augustine had heard it all before and had a refresher from Lazarus earlier. It didn't bother him one bit. He restarted the questions. "So, did you drive to Burger King?" "Yep." "Alone?" "Yep." "And the TV?" "I've told you. Keith Lemon. I've just remembered. David Hasselhoff was on it. You know, the one with the deep voice. Used to be on Knight Rider. We'll check that out. What happened on the episode? I was falling in and out of sleep, but I remember he answered questions on murders in hotels. Random. Chapter 30.
He's fucking with us,
Lou said from outside the interview room. He had been asked by Augustine to watch. It was one of those rooms with a wall that looked like a mirror from the inside, but could be seen through from the other side. There was nobody there for him to talk to, so he gave himself a running commentary on the events unfolding in front of his eyes. He had also been given instructions to check out the information given by Lazarus. Augustine wanted to get things moving as quickly as possible. He was developing a reputation in the force for not solving cases quickly, sometimes not at all. It felt like time was of the essence. Lazarus fit the bill as far as he was concerned. All he needed was to prove it. Lou checked the television listings on the laptop and found that the Hoff was indeed a guest on the episode of Celebrity Juice, the Keith Lemon television program the night before. And it was the first time it had been broadcast, not a rerun. Maybe there was some truth in what Ken was saying. Lou looked up the episode on the ITV catch-up service and watched through on fast forward to see the answers given by David Hasselhoff. Amazingly, there were questions on murdering people in a hotel room. Lou stood up to interrupt the interview. Chapter 31. Ash! Ash! They were the words ringing around inside his head. He was starting to stir. His shoulder had caused him so much pain that he had passed out. Ash could hear a voice. It was one he recognized, but he couldn't put a name to it. Ash! Ash! Ah, Electra. That was the voice. He rolled over and saw a few drops of blood leave his hoodie and hit the ground. As he sat up further, the hoodie clung to his t-shirt and soaked further into his skin. He wanted the sticky sensation to stop. Electra, help me. She checked his torso and she laid him back down on the ground, this time on his back. There were no moans and groans from him as she started around the abdomen, before moving down to check his legs. It was only when she reached his chest that Ash gave any sign that he had been hurt. The noise got steadily louder until she reached the back of his head. Then he gave a sudden yelp before falling silent. Electra asked question after question, trying to get a fix on what was happening. What happened? Where is the pain? Have you been hit? What day is it? What year is it? Who am I? He managed accurate answers for the final 3 questions, but there was a lot more vagueness when answering the first 3. In the meantime, she could hear the sirens of the ambulance service. She had beaten them there by a good 3 minutes. She looked out of the window and saw the ambulance crews searching for the casualties they had been sent for. She managed to unlock a window, key left in lock, and shout down. She was sure they would be up in less than a minute. Chapter 32. Lou entered the room, hoping that he could help Augustine and Gary get to the bottom of something that once seemed so straightforward, but now felt like more of a maze.
Guys, I'm going to sit in with you, if that's okay,
Lou asked, without waiting for an answer. He sat with the rest of them. Nobody responded. As the conversation went on, Lazarus gave more and more detail. Lou listened in, waiting for the right time to talk. It came as he heard Ken Lazarus ask for a drink of water. Gary left the room to get him one. Lou spoke up for the first time since he had entered the room.
Ken, how long ago did you work for the Campanile?
He asked. I was only there for a short space of time. They didn't like me. I didn't like the job. It was over in a flash, Lazarus replied.
What didn't you like about it?
It was like working in a maze.
The bit you see out the front as customers looks like it is in order, corridors leading to rooms, but the back areas were an absolute mess. Rooms led onto rooms and then onto nowhere. I confused myself daily. Interesting. And did you never ask anyone for help? I was always asking for help. I didn't get a pass, you see, so I had to always ask someone else on the team to get me through one door or another. If there was nobody around, I could be there for half an hour or more. I didn't mind that bit. I was still being paid, Lazarus offered. Gary still hadn't returned to the room with the water. And why would Pierre White visit you? We already know that he was there today, Lou pressed. We had a business relationship from years ago. I did lots of his dirty work. He paid me cash. We used to keep it at arm's length, but he evidently wanted to speak to me urgently today. That's when I sent him packing. I'm a lone wolf, you see. And how did you send him packing?
Chapter 33. Electra had been watching Ash for some time, while the paramedics dealt with Pierre White. Neither her nor Ash thought there was any life in the guy, but the paramedics didn't act that way. They rushed around, trying to get lines in, access cleared, and the head steady. These were not the signs of attention to someone who was already dead. Ash had been focusing on a point in the distance. Electra thought it was to help him deal with the pain. She had been told on a visit to the hospital in her youth that a way of both dealing with pain and stopping yourself from being sick was to find and pick a point on the wall and focus on it, breathing in and out through your mouth. She couldn't see Ash's mouth as she was knelt behind him, with him still on his side, but she could see the focus. Black and white, black and white, black and white, Ash repeated. This is no time for football, Ash, Electra responded. It was always part of the banter in the northeast between men. It passed Electra and most of her female friends by. Oh, not football, he whispered, before going into what looked like a light sleep. Electra left him. After they had dealt with Pierre White, their focus moved to the other injury in the room. Ash whispered something in Electra's ear as she gave him a small hug on his right-hand side, only on the way to the ambulance, where he sat alongside the second paramedic and Pierre White in the back. Only one ambulance was needed, as Ash could sit up. The first set of paramedics called and turned the other one away. There were likely more pressing things for them to attend to. Chapter 34. Electra waved Ash off. She knew he couldn't see her from the back of the ambulance, but it just felt right that she saw him away. As she looked across the street, the receptionist from the building was walking back across the road in her direction with 2 disposable cups in her hands. Electra looked down at the case she had in her hand. It was filled with £20 notes. She'd already checked that. Ash recognized it from the grainy CCTV images and couldn't take his eyes off it as he lay there waiting for the paramedics to attend to him. Sat in front of the case were a pair of white shoes. The tops of the shoes were as light as the sun. The soles had bloodstains on them. He'd instructed Electra to pick them up and get them back to the station. She was wearing gloves, as not to leave any additional fingerprints on the case or the shoes, even though it was obvious the journey it had taken. Electra grabbed a cup of tea from the hand of the receptionist as she headed out into the evening air, crisp and cold. The sky was almost totally devoid of cloud, a sign that they were in for a cold one. She headed to her car and started the journey back to the station. Chapter 35. Lou placed the tool roll on the desk. He unravelled it, exposing the missing screwdriver. Lazarus knew the game was up. We used to work well together. Pierre had all the connections I needed. I would do all the dirty work he wanted. There was a ready supply of cash, too. Back in the day, John O'Toole overheard one of our conversations. We were really careless, chatting away in the sports bar near the Campanile without checking if we were the only ones inside. We weren't. O'Toole confronted the pair of us and asked for money. The only condition Pierre gave him was that he left his job as a PCSO. White would make him rich, but he couldn't have someone on your side of the fence on the payroll. I'm sure you understand. It was a good arrangement for all to begin with, but then O'Toole got greedy. He asked for more and more. Pierre arranged for me to give him a suitcase full of notes as one final payoff. But deep down, we knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The man would keep on coming. Well, White came round today to tell me he'd dealt with him. There would be no more demands. As far as I was concerned, that told me there was only one loose end left. That's when I stabbed Pierre White with a screwdriver. With him out of the way, I thought I could get on with my life. Maybe not now. White said that John O'Toole had seen too much. He said that those eyes needed to be cleansed. Chapter 36. The paramedic was dealing with White while the other was driving at high speed towards the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Gateshead. All the while, the paramedic checked gauges, spoke softly to White, and occasionally looked over at Ash to make sure he was doing okay. The immediate diagnosis was a dislocated shoulder. He needed pain relief before having it reset. He was going to be all right. Around half a mile from the hospital, the second paramedic put their head through the hatch to check on progress with the one that was driving. In the few moments where the paramedics were both concentrated on the road, Pierre White took his oxygen mask off and beckoned Ash over. With a groan, as he moved his shoulder forward on leaving his seat, Ash moved towards the man he had spoken to earlier in the day and listened. First, he showed a screwdriver on his top pocket. Small, but big enough to cause quite some damage. Secondly, he spoke. "I killed John O'Toole," Pierre White said in Ash's ear. "I know," Ash replied. "I know." Chapter 37. That night, Augustine had a dream. He was handing out umbrellas when people entered a building, even though it wasn't raining. He couldn't work out what the building was. All he found was that these people didn't want the umbrellas. But, in his dream, Augustine knew people would leave the building at some stage, and it will rain one day. You'll need an umbrella at some time in the future.